The challenge. The crystalline spires of Mount Ethereal pierced the violet sky of Nexus 7, its peaks shrouded in swirling, luminescent clouds. James Harrison stood at the base of the mountain, his weathered climbing gear stark against the sleek, biomechanical suits of the alien competitors surrounding him. The Krillian officials, with their towering, crystalline bodies, looked down at him with what he interpreted as amusement. A human dares to attempt our sacred climb. The chief judge, Zyxtal, spoke in perfectly translated standard, though his voice carried harmonics that made James's teeth vibrate. Your species barely manages interstellar travel, let alone understanding the complexities of our world. James adjusted the straps of his traditional climbing harness, feeling the familiar weight of his oxygen tanks and survival gear. Around him, 20 alien competitors from various advanced civilizations performed last-minute checks on their anti-gravity modules and environmental shields. He was the only one wearing what they considered primitive equipment. With respect, Your Excellence, James replied, keeping his voice steady, humans have been climbing mountains since before we discovered fire. We may not have your technology, but we understand mountains in our bones. A ripple of crystalline laughter echoed through the gathering. The Krillians, evolved from crystalline life forms, had never understood organic species' fascination with their sacred peak. Mount Ethereal wasn't just tall, it was alive in ways Earth's mountains could never be. Its crystal faces shifted unpredictably, its atmosphere contained particles that could freeze blood in seconds, and its magnetic fields played havoc with any technology more complicated than simple mechanical tools. The mountain had claimed the lives of dozens of advanced alien climbers who relied too heavily on their technology. No one had reached the summit in over a century of attempts. The Krillians had turned it into a challenge, a way to prove their superiority over other species who thought they could conquer their world. Zyxtal's crystalline form shimmered with what James had learned to recognize as condescension. The briefing begins now. Pay attention, human, if you wish to survive even the first phase. Holographic displays materialized around them, showing the mountain's 3 distinct zones. The lower crystal fields, with their razor-sharp formations and unpredictable gravitational eddies. The middle reach, where magnetic storms could render advanced technology worse than useless. And finally, the summit sphere, where the very air crystallized and shattered with each breath. As the other competitors absorbed the data directly through their neural interfaces, James took careful notes in his waterproof notebook. Old school, they called it. Reliable, he called it. He had spent months studying everything humanity knew about crystal-based life forms and their environments. His gear was carefully chosen, aluminum instead of steel to resist magnetic fields, mechanical devices instead of electronic ones, and specially treated fabric that could withstand crystalline microparticles. The climb begins at first light, Zyxtal announced. May the worthy reach the peak. His gaze lingered on James. And may the unworthy survive their failure. That evening, as the alien competitors gathered in their high-tech shelters, James sat alone outside his simple tent, watching the mountain's crystalline face catch the light of Nexus VII's 3 moons. The peak seemed to shift and dance, a reminder that this was no ordinary climb. He reviewed his notes one final time, checking his planned route against the mountain's known patterns. A shadow fell across his notebook. Looking up, he found himself facing Clara, a Veldari climber whose species was known for their atmospheric adaptation capabilities. Her environmental suit hummed softly as it adjusted to the thinning air. You cannot seriously intend to climb with such basic equipment, she said, her multifaceted eyes scanning his gear with what might have been concern. James smiled, running a hand along his well-worn ice axe. This basic equipment has helped humans reach the highest points on thousands of worlds. Sometimes, simpler is better. The mountain will kill you, Clara stated matter-of-factly. Your species' stubborn reliance on primitive methods will be your downfall. Maybe, James admitted, standing to face her. Or maybe that's exactly what will save me when all your technology fails. He gestured toward the mountain, where crystal formations caught and fractured moonlight into rainbow patterns. Mount Ethereal isn't just a pile of rock and crystal. It's alive, in its way. And sometimes, the best way to climb a living mountain is to do it the old-fashioned way, one hand over the other, feeling your way up, listening to what the mountain tells you. Clara's expression was unreadable behind her atmospheric mask, but her posture suggested skepticism. As she turned to leave, she paused. When your primitive equipment fails you, do not expect assistance. The mountain shows no mercy to the foolish. James watched her go, then turned back to his preparations. Tomorrow would test everything he knew about climbing, about survival, and about himself. But as he studied the shifting faces of Mount Ethereal, he felt something the aliens might never understand, the pure, simple joy of facing a mountain with nothing but skill, determination, and respect for the climb itself. The first test. The pre-dawn light of Nexus 7 cast an ethereal glow across the crystalline landscape, refracting through the mountain's translucent faces in patterns that seemed to pulse with life. James stood at the designated starting point, methodically checking his gear one final time. Around him, the alien competitors made last-minute adjustments to their sophisticated equipment, their biomechanical suits humming with power. Final warnings, announced Zyxtal, his crystalline form catching the early light. The mountain's defensive systems are active. Your technology may fail. Your judgment may falter. The summit cares not for your species or your pride. James tightened the straps of his climbing harness, feeling the reassuring weight of his equipment. While others carried quantum stabilizers and gravity nullifiers, his pack contained time-tested tools, pitons, ropes, ice axes, and mechanical ascenders. He had added only one piece of modern technology, a basic emergency beacon, though he doubted it would work in the mountain's magnetic fields. The lower crystal fields stretched before them, a maze of razor-sharp formations that jutted from the ground at impossible angles. Even from here, James could see the gravitational distortions, visible as slight bends in the light. The alien climbers activated their anti-grav modules, preparing to navigate the field by floating above it. "Begin," Zyxtal commanded, and the race was on. The alien competitors shot forward, their technology allowing them to soar over the initial crystal barriers. James took a different approach. He moved slowly, deliberately, studying the formations. Years of experience had taught him that the obvious path wasn't always the best one. The first hour proved him right. As he carefully picked his way through the crystal maze, he heard the first cries of frustration. The mountain's gravitational eddies were playing havoc with the anti-grav systems. Several climbers found themselves suddenly plummeting or shooting sideways when their equipment failed to compensate. "Primitive," sneered a voice above him. It was Kraz, a Synthan climber whose metallic skin gleamed in the growing light. "You'll never reach the first checkpoint at this rate." James didn't waste breath responding. He had noticed something about the crystal formations, they weren't random. There was a pattern, subtle but present, like the grain in wood or the stratification in rock. By following this pattern, he could navigate the field while minimizing his exposure to the gravitational anomalies. The first real test came at a massive crystal wall that blocked the entire route. The alien climbers were attempting to go over it, their technology struggling against the intense magnetic fields at higher altitudes. James studied the base of the wall, running his hands over the crystal surface. There, a series of natural handholds, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. He began to climb, moving laterally along the wall rather than straight up. The crystal was cold under his gloved hands, but he could feel vibrations through his fingers, the mountain's pulse. As he climbed, he remembered his training in the crystal caves of Europa, where human explorers had learned to read similar formations. A sudden shout drew his attention. Above him, one of the alien climbers was caught in a gravitational eddy, their anti-grav system spinning uselessly. James watched as they deployed an emergency shield, barely saving themselves from being dashed against the crystal face. "The mountain responds to force with force," James muttered to himself, remembering an old climbing instructor's words. He continued his careful traverse, feeling rather than seeing the safe path forward. By midday, he had cleared the first major obstacle. To his surprise, he wasn't far behind the leaders. Several competitors had already retreated, their expensive equipment damaged or destroyed by the mountain's defenses. Clara passed overhead, her environmental suit crackling with strain. "Still alive, human," she called down. "Perhaps there is something to your primitive methods after all." James smiled behind his protective mask. He had reached a small plateau, a natural resting point where the crystal formations created a relatively stable pocket in the gravitational chaos. Taking advantage of the break, he pulled out his notebook and began sketching what he'd learned about the mountain's patterns. The crystal's surface wasn't just a barrier, it was a language. The formations told stories of pressure and growth, of magnetic fields and gravitational forces. By reading these signs, he could predict where the next safe passage might be, where the gravitational eddies would be weakest. As he made his notes, a deep rumble shook the mountain. The crystal formations around him began to shift, grinding against each other with a sound like breaking glass. The mountain was changing, responding to the presence of the climbers. Above, he could hear the panic as the alien competitors rushed to recalibrate their equipment. James packed away his notebook and stood, adjusting his harness. The next section would be harder, the crystal formations were denser, the gravitational distortions more intense. But he had something the others didn't, an understanding of the mountain's rhythm, its patterns, its life. He checked his emergency beacon out of habit, unsurprised to find it dead. The mountain's magnetic fields had rendered it useless, just as he'd expected. From here on, he would rely entirely on his skills, his equipment, and his ability to read the living mountain beneath his feet. As he prepared to continue, he caught sight of Zyxtal watching from a distant observation point. The Krillion's crystalline form seemed to pulse with what might have been curiosity. Perhaps, James thought, they were beginning to understand that humanity's primitive approach wasn't about technological limitation, it was about choice, about understanding, about respect for the mountain itself. With renewed determination, James began to plot his route through the next section. The real challenge was just beginning, but he was ready. The mountain might be alive, might be hostile to intruders, but it was still a mountain. And mountains, living or not, were what humans did best. The storm within. The middle reach of Mount Ethereal lived up to its reputation. Here, the crystal formations weren't just sharp, they sang. A haunting resonance filled the air as magnetic storms swept through the spires, creating eerie harmonics that seemed to pierce directly into James's mind. The few remaining alien competitors hovered at the edge of this section, their sophisticated sensors trying to map a safe route through the magnetic chaos. James paused to take a drink from his water supply, watching as crystalline particles danced in the air around him. The mountain's defensive systems were stronger here, he could feel it in the way the very air seemed to resist his presence. His mechanical altimeter spun wildly, the only indication he needed that any electronic equipment would be worse than useless in this zone. "Your luck ends here, human," called out Kraz, the Synthen climber's metallic skin now showing signs of stress from the mountain's assault. "The magnetic storms will tear apart anything that moves through them. Without proper shielding, your organic body won't survive." James studied the crystalline walls before him, noting how the formations had changed. The patterns he'd observed in the lower crystal fields were still present, but they were more complex here, interwoven with new rhythms he was only beginning to understand. The singing crystals weren't random, they were responding to something. "Sometimes," James replied, more to himself than to Kraz, "the only way through a storm is to learn its rhythm." He began his ascent, moving in time with the crystal harmonics. Years of climbing had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about these resonances reminded him of the wind patterns in Earth's highest peaks. Just as experienced climbers could read the wind, he was learning to read the magnetic songs of Mount Ethereal. The first magnetic storm hit without warning. Above him, He heard the screech of failing equipment as several alien climbers were forced to retreat, their protective fields unable to withstand the intensity. James pressed himself against the crystal face, feeling the energy surge through the mountain. Instead of fighting it, he waited, listening to the changing harmonics. There was a pattern to the storms, a rhythm that matched the pulsing light within the crystal formations. When the next surge came, James was ready. He moved with it, using the brief moments between pulses to make progress. His mechanical gear, simple and unaffected by the magnetic fields, proved to be his greatest advantage. Halfway through the middle reach, he encountered the first real crisis. A massive crystal spire, vibrating with energy, blocked the most obvious path upward. The alien climbers were attempting to circumvent it using their remaining functional technology, but James saw something they didn't: hairline fractures in the crystal face, creating a natural chimney. It would be a tight squeeze, and one wrong move would mean being crushed by tons of living crystal, but it was a path. As he prepared for the climb, he heard Clara's voice from somewhere above. "That crevice is unstable. The resonance patterns will tear it apart." James checked his harness one last time. "Maybe," he called back, "or maybe it's not about stability. Maybe it's about harmony." He began the ascent through the chimney, moving in perfect sync with the crystal's vibrations. The space was tight, forcing him to press his back against one wall and his feet against the other. The singing of the crystals was deafening here, but James had begun to understand its language. Each change in pitch warned of shifting magnetic fields, each harmonic suggested a safe moment to move. Halfway up the chimney, disaster struck. A particularly violent magnetic storm caused the entire spire to shudder. James found himself trapped as the crystal walls began to contract. In that moment of crisis, he remembered something from his studies of crystal-based life forms: they responded to pressure patterns. Instead of trying to force his way up or down, James began to tap rhythmically on the crystal wall, matching the mountain's own pulse. The pressure eased slightly, just enough for him to continue his ascent. When he finally emerged from the chimney, he found himself on a narrow ledge overlooking a valley of singing spires. The view was breathtaking. Magnetic storms created auroral patterns that danced between the crystal formations, and the harmonics had settled into a haunting symphony. Only 3 other climbers remained in sight, their technological shields flickering weakly against the mountain's defenses. As James caught his breath, he noticed something remarkable. The crystal beneath his feet was pulsing in sync with his heartbeat. The mountain wasn't just alive, it was learning, adapting, perhaps even trying to communicate in its own alien way. He pulled out his notebook, now filled with sketches of crystal patterns and notes about harmonic frequencies. The next section would be even more challenging, but he had learned something vital: Mount Ethereal wasn't an obstacle to be conquered. It was a partner in a dance, one that required respect, understanding, and the willingness to move in harmony with forces far greater than oneself. Above him, the summit sphere beckoned, its crystalline peaks shrouded in swirling, energetic storms. The final test would require everything he had learned, and more. But for the first time since beginning the climb, James felt something unexpected, a sense that the mountain itself was watching, waiting to see if this strange organic being could truly understand its ancient, crystalline song. Echoes of humanity. The transition to the summit sphere brought an eerie silence. The singing crystals fell quiet, replaced by a deep, subsonic vibration that James felt in his bones. The air had grown so thin that every breath was a conscious effort, and crystalline particles hung suspended in space, creating ghostly patterns in the alien light. Only 2 other climbers remained, Clara and Kraz. Their advanced equipment was failing rapidly now, protective fields flickering like dying stars. James could see the strain in their movements as they fought against the mountain's increasingly hostile defenses. The summit sphere lived up to its name. The mountain's peak was encased in a perfect spherical formation of living crystal, its surface constantly shifting and reforming. The final checkpoint lay just below it, a small plateau where the 3 remaining climbers gathered to assess their options. The sphere is impenetrable, Kraz announced, his metallic skin showing deep stress fractures. Our scans can't penetrate it, and the energy readings are off the scale. No technology we have can breach it. Clara's environmental suit was barely functioning, its power cells nearly depleted. The Krillians were right, she admitted. We were arrogant to think we could conquer their sacred peak with technology alone. James studied the sphere, noting how the crystalline particles in the air seemed to flow around it in distinct patterns. The mountain's pulse was stronger here, its rhythm more complex. He was about to share his observations when everything changed. A massive energy surge rippled through the mountain. The crystal formations around them began to resonate at a frequency that shattered Kraz's remaining shields. The Synthan climber stumbled, his metallic form beginning to crack under the mountain's assault. Clara's suit failed completely, leaving her gasping in the thin, crystalline air. James faced a choice that would define not just his climb, but what it meant to be human. The summit was within reach, with both competitors disabled, he could make the final ascent alone. It was what the Krillians expected, what the mountain seemed to demand. Survival of the fittest, evolution in action. But that wasn't the human way. Not his way. Hold on, he called out, already moving toward his struggling competitors. From his pack, he pulled out his emergency supplies, an extra oxygen mask for Clara, a length of specialized rope that could help stabilize Kraz's fracturing form. Why? Kraz demanded as James worked to secure the rope around his crystalline injuries. You could reach the summit while we're helpless. Isn't that what your primitive species does? Take advantage of weakness. James continued his work, his movements precise despite the thin air and numbing cold. Actually, he replied, humans became the dominant species on our world not just through competition, but through cooperation. We survived because we learned to help each other, to turn competitors into allies. He helped Clara adjust the oxygen mask, showing her how to regulate the flow to match the mountain's rhythm. The mountain isn't just testing our ability to climb, he explained. It's testing our understanding. And sometimes understanding means knowing when to set aside personal glory for something more important. The mountain's pulse changed. The hostile resonance that had threatened to tear them apart softened, becoming almost harmonious. The crystalline particles in the air began to swirl in new patterns, creating pathways that hadn't been visible before. Look, James pointed to the sphere above them. The mountain is showing us something. Where before the surface had been uniformly impenetrable, now they could see faint lines traversing its face, like veins in crystal or rivers of light. The patterns matched the rhythm of their combined breathing, three different species finding harmony in crisis. I don't understand, Clara said, her voice stronger now. The mountain, it's responding to us working together. James smiled behind his mask. The Krillians are a crystalline species. They evolved through symbiosis, through the integration of different elements into a greater whole. Maybe that's what the mountain was waiting for, not for someone to conquer it, but for someone to understand its fundamental nature. Kraz studied his reinforced limbs, the rope James had used somehow helping to stabilize his fractured form. You suggest we attempt the final ascent, together? No one has ever reached the summit. The mountain has never allowed it. Maybe, James replied, that's because no one ever tried to reach it the right way. He looked at his fellow climbers, seeing not competitors now but partners in something unprecedented. What do you say? Should we show the mountain what different species can accomplish when they work as one? The sphere pulsed above them, its light casting long shadows across the crystalline landscape. The final test awaited, not of their technology or their individual skills, but of their ability to transcend the boundaries that had kept the summit forever out of reach. As they began to plan their joint ascent, James felt the mountain's rhythm change again. The hostile force that had fought them every step of the way was transforming into something else, an invitation, perhaps, or a challenge of a different kind. The true test of Mount Ethereal, he realized, had never been about reaching the physical summit at all. Symphony of Ascent. The summit sphere loomed above them, its crystalline surface now alive with flowing patterns of light. James, Clara, and Cross had formed an unlikely alliance, their differences becoming strengths as they prepared for the final ascent. The mountain's pulse had settled into a steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat waiting in anticipation. The patterns, James explained, pointing to the veins of light traversing the sphere, they're moving in harmony with our combined life signs. 3 different species, 3 different rhythms, creating something new together. Using James's remaining rope, they connected themselves in a triangular formation. Krah's metallic form, though damaged, provided anchor points stronger than any natural rock. Clara's atmospheric sensitivity, even without her suit's advanced systems, allowed her to predict the mountain's energy fluctuations. And James's understanding of the crystal patterns showed them where and when to move. They began their ascent as one, each movement carefully coordinated. The sphere's surface, which had seemed impenetrable before, now responded to their touch. Where their combined rhythms matched the mountain's pulse, handholds and footholds appeared in the crystal face. It's like the mountain is teaching us, Clara observed as they climbed higher. The crystalline particles in the air swirled around them, no longer hostile but supportive, creating paths of light they could follow. Kraz, his metallic form resonating with the mountain's frequency, added, the Krillians spoke of their sacred peak as a guardian of wisdom. Perhaps this is what they meant, not a test of strength or technology, but of understanding. The higher they climbed, the more the mountain revealed. The crystal formations began to display images, histories written in light and resonance. They saw the evolution of the Krillians, how their crystalline ancestors had learned to merge with the living mountain. They witnessed countless failed attempts to reach the summit, each focused on conquest rather than comprehension. Halfway up the sphere, they encountered their final challenge. The crystal face before them was completely smooth, offering no apparent way forward. The mountain's pulse intensified, waiting. Look at how we're positioned, James said suddenly, noting their triangular formation. The same pattern as the original crystal structure of this world. He remembered seeing it in the briefing data, the basic geometric form that had given rise to all Krillian life. Understanding dawned on them all at once. This wasn't just about climbing anymore. It was about completing a circuit, about different forms of life coming together to create something greater than its parts. They pressed their hands against the crystal surface, each at a point of the triangle. The mountain's song reached a crescendo, and the barrier between them and the crystal began to dissolve. For a moment, they were one with the mountain, organic, metallic, and crystalline consciousness merging in perfect harmony. The summit, when they reached it, was nothing like they had expected. Instead of a physical peak, they found themselves in the heart of the living mountain. The crystal sphere had become transparent, offering a view of not just Nexus 7, but the entire galaxy. The crystalline particles that had surrounded them throughout their climb now danced with purpose, forming images and patterns that told stories of countless worlds and species. Below, they could see Zyxtal and the other Krillians gathered at the mountain's base. The crystalline beings were glowing with an intensity never before seen, their forms resonating with the same frequency that now pulsed through the summit. They knew, James realized. They knew the mountain could never be conquered alone. This was never about proving superiority, it was about proving we could work together. Clara removed her borrowed oxygen mask, finding that the air at the summit was now perfectly breathable for all of them. Your primitive understanding of the mountain led us here, she acknowledged. Sometimes the simplest truths are the hardest to grasp. Krah's metallic form had begun to heal, the mountain's energy helping to repair the damage. The galaxy sees humanity as a young, untested species, he said. But you've shown us a wisdom that goes beyond technology. The mountain's final gift came in the form of knowledge, transmitted through the crystalline matrix that surrounded them. The summit had always been accessible, but only to those who understood that true advancement came not through competition, but through cooperation. The Krillians had been waiting for species that could learn this lesson, that could help spread this understanding throughout the galaxy. As they began their descent, forever changed by their experience, James thought about the countless mountains he had climbed on Earth. Each had taught him something, had helped him understand a little more about himself and his place in the universe. But Mount Ethereal had taught all of them, perhaps the most important lesson of all, that the greatest heights can only be reached together. The Galactic Mountaineering Championship ended not with a single victor, but with a new beginning. The story of how a human, armed with nothing but respect, understanding, and the willingness to help others, had changed the way the galaxy viewed both mountains and the meaning of achievement, would be told for generations to come. And Mount Ethereal, the living mountain that had waited eons for different species to learn to climb as one, continued its eternal song, now enriched by the harmony of cooperation it had helped create.